Hare Krishna, and welcome to our virtual Sunday feast coming to you today from Sage Cottage in County Wicklow, Republic of Ireland. My name is Kormadas. You may recall that the last time I spoke, we began a marathon of reading from my book, The Great Transcendental Adventure, the Pastimes of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada in Australia and New Zealand. I wrote this book a few years ago, and I've decided, for your pleasure and historical education and spiritual edification, to read regularly from this book, from cover to cover, to tell you the whole wonderful story of how the Krishna consciousness movement spread to the great lands below, the southernmost part of this globe, as Srila Prabhupada described Australia and New Zealand. So the last time I spoke, we were reading about how Srila Prabhupada said there's no necessity of many devotees going to a new country or city to start a temple. Even one devotee is sufficient. And that's exactly what happened in the history of the Krishna consciousness movement's spread throughout the Australasian region. One devotee, Bali Mahdan, went and started chanting Hare Krishna in the streets of Sydney. He sent out letters to various temples around the world. Is there anybody out there who would like to send a devotee to help me? And by some trick of Krishna, Upendra was chosen. Srila Prabhupada personally sent him. Yes, Prabhupada said, you can go and you can help Bali Mahdan in Australia. So now we had two devotees chanting Hare Krishna in Sydney, and it was 1970. So many years ago. I'll continue on from where we left off. The two young devotees pushed on their preaching efforts. Gradually, a few people showed more than a passing interest in their Sankirtan efforts. Long-haired Bill Willis from Berkeley, California Bill to his friends, was becoming more and more disgruntled with material affairs. His father was a Pan Am pilot and had offered Bill a free ticket anywhere in the world. His friends had headed off to Europe, but Bill, now a vegetarian and a macrobiotic, decided to head for Hawaii, Auckland and Sydney. Renting a flat on Darlinghurst Road in King's Cross, Bill sometimes found himself wandering the streets, past the seedy bars and strip clubs. This was a red light area of Sydney. One day he sighted a devotee in a knitted cap and sweater, and as they both crossed paths, the devotee smiled warmly and said, "Hare Krishna." They talked, and the devotee, who introduced himself as Upendra, invited Bill to their temple. It wasn't Bill's first encounter with devotees. During his Berkeley days, he had given a devotee on Telegraph Avenue a donation in exchange for a card with the Maha Mantra on it. Eager to experience the promised sublimity, Bill had started chanting straight away, shortly after he met the devotees as they chanted outside the University of California, Berkeley campus, and yet again in San Francisco at an avant-garde outdoor art fest. Now in Sydney, Bill was happy to discover that the temple was only a few minutes from his apartment. He started visiting the temple daily and was impressed by Upendra's convincing presentation of the philosophy and Krishna consciousness in general. Some days he would join them in their street chanting and especially enjoyed visiting the temple for prasadam, which he found delicious. Upendra was a very, very good cook. 20-year-old Jan Wesley, a film actress from Melbourne, had recently co-starred with Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones in Ned Kelly, the story of Australia's most notorious bushranger. Now she was pursuing her film and television acting career in Sydney. One day, as she returned from work to her apartment in King's Cross, she saw Bali Mahdan, Upendra and Bill chanting together at the El Alamein Park. Jan recalls, "At first I thought they looked a little strange. Were they Buddhists? But I recognized their mantra from their musical hair, which was very big at the time. I approached Bali Mahdan and asked him what he was doing. He told me, and he handed me a card with the mantra on it. He suggested that if I sang this mantra, it would free me from all anxiety. I took the card home and I stuck it on the kitchen wall. I was taking singing lessons, so I decided to practice by singing the mantra every day." That was it. She was hooked. I was reading in the Srimad Bhagavatam this morning, Agyanad Atavagyanad. If one chants knowingly or unknowingly about the glories of Krishna, in other words, if one chants the Hare Krishna mantra, one may not know anything about the Hare Krishna mantra, but it will act, just like fire will burn, even if you're not aware of its potency. Prabhupada told the story when he was a little boy. He was playing with matches and he caught fire to his dhoti. And if it wasn't for a gentleman that was walking past, Prabhupada would have burnt himself up. So little children, they play with fire, and mature people also sometimes have to light a fire. The mature person knows the effect of fire, the child doesn't. Nevertheless, fire burns. Fire doesn't take into consideration whether you know or don't know how it works. So similarly, the chanting of Hare Krishna works whether you know about it or not. So Jan started chanting Hare Krishna to practice her singing. In his continuing correspondence with his two young disciples in Sydney, Srila Prabhupada had encouraged them to expand their preaching activities to include university campuses. In one letter, he had given an analogy. If one attempted to bend mature bamboo, he said, it would crack and break. Australia's youth, however, were like green bamboo, which, while young, could still be bent and carved. The younger generation, Prabhupada concluded, were the future hope of the Krishna consciousness movement. Tuesday, 12th of March, 1970, was a mild autumn day at Sydney University. Students sprawled about, chatting and eating their lunch on the well-kept lawns that surrounded the striking Gothic-style buildings of Australia's oldest campus. Upendra and Bali Mahdan had planned for an inaugural Sankirtan Festival on the lawns that morning. Sydney University's student newspaper Honi Swa had enthusiastically advertised the event. "Hare Krishna arrives!" exclaimed the article, accompanying a photo of the New York devotees performing street Sankirtan. I'll read you from this article. Quote, "Two disciples of the Hare Krishna movement will conduct a front lawn be-in of Hare Krishna chanting and dancing in transcendental ecstasy on Tuesday. They believe that the words Hare Krishna produce transcendental sound vibrations, which instill a state of ecstasy on the chanter, freeing him from the material, illusory complexities of life. A disciple will set himself up in a park with a drum or other musical instruments and begin the Hare Krishna chant. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Those who respond to the transcendental sound vibrations are immediately drawn to the source of the sound. In a short time, hundreds of people may be seated with the disciple, all singing the spiritual chant. And this is what the disciples hope to achieve today. The disciples claim that Hare Krishna is the transcendental process for reviving our dormant spiritual consciousness. As original spirit souls, We are all originally Krishna-conscious entities, but due to our association with matter from time immemorial, our consciousness is now adulterated by the material atmosphere. By chanting this transcendental vibration, we can cleanse away all misgivings from our hearts. The article continued. The disciples promise a permanent state of high without the use of artificial stimulants, with no come down after each new apex of pleasure is attained. They do not require any payment to be made by followers. Their worship consists of chanting, singing, and dancing, but most important are the words of the Hare Krishna chant. Everyone has probably heard the Hare Krishna record, which was sung by the members of the London Radha Krishna Temple and produced by George Harrison by now, but few may realize the deep spiritual significance behind the words. Come along on Tuesday to find out. End of article. That's what they call a rip snorter article in Australia. By the time Upendra and Bill arrived, quite a crowd had gathered. Upendra was dressed in a yellow dhoti, short-sleeved kurta, and a neat sleeveless sweater. That's how Upendra always dressed. Meticulous dresser. Very attractive. He wore a yellow turban and smiled brightly as he began the melodic kirtan, accompanied by saffron-clad Bali Mahdan. Bill, who had recently moved into the temple, chanted beside them with freshly shaven head. It was a striking sight. Upendra's chanting and the devotees' response drew a large circle of students. As the drum rhythmically thudded and the sweet tinkling kartal sound filled the quadrangle, the students started dancing in a circle. The kirtan increased in tempo. Soon hundreds of young men and women were chanting in a circle, some holding hands, some leaping freestyle in the Transcendental Be-In. Suddenly a young man rushed up to Upendra. "You're on the radio," he said. He pressed a small transistor radio to Upendra's ear, who, now beaming brightly, listened to the radio between mantras, nodding and grinning in approval. It was Yamuna and the London Devotees, chanting Hare Krishna with George Harrison on his latest Apple album. After the ebullient 1-hour kirtan, Upendra and Bali Mahdan were convinced that there was great hope for spreading Krishna consciousness in Australia. These boys and girls were making spiritual advancement and having fun. Bali Mahdan and Upendra began to make plans to start a Hare Krishna club at Sydney University. Bali Mahdan and Upendra kept Srila Prabhupada informed of the latest developments on campus. Prabhupada was happy to hear of the university's success, describing it as engladdening. He continued to stress to them the urgent need of spreading Krishna consciousness amongst Australia's youth. Here's a lovely quote from one of Prabhupada's letters to Bali Mahdan. Quote, "Just try to convince the younger section about the importance of this movement and how this one single venture can solve all the problems of the world. Krishna consciousness is not dry. It includes all the varieties of human cultivation of knowledge. We can give direction in politics, in sociology, in religion, in philosophy, in arts, in music, in aesthetics. It is complete. Simply, we have to administer this novel idea to the people in general very magnificently." This chapter is entitled, "This Novel Idea." Srila Prabhupada had chosen well to describe Krishna consciousness as a novel idea. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had used the same term, implying something hitherto unknown, new, or unusual in his last instructions sent in a letter to Prabhupada only 2 weeks before leaving this world in 1937. "I have every hope," he had said, "that you can turn yourself into a very good English preacher if you serve the mission to inculcate the novel impression of Lord Chaitanya's teachings in the people in general, as well as philosophers and religionists. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's great hope was no empty wish. He had read and appreciated a poem written by Prabhupada in 1935, in which he had proved that he understood the mind and mission of his spiritual master. In this poem, Prabhupada described the plight of humanity. Quote, "Forgotten Krishna, we fallen souls, paying most heavy the illusion's toll, darkness around all untrace, his only hope, the only hope, his divine grace." The fallen souls had forgotten their original spiritual relationship with God. They were loitering in the material world. And yet, as confidant of the Father sometimes visits a wayward child with a message to remind him of his real home, Prabhupada described his spiritual master as a messenger from Lord Chaitanya. Quote, "Message of service thou hast brought, a healthful life as Chaitanya wrought. Unknown to all, it's full of brace. That's your gift, your divine grace." It was clear that Krishna consciousness was this previously unknown message of service. And reviving the sleeping souls to their real waking identity as Krishna's long-lost servants, was the business of the Vaishnava preacher. Fully awake, the fallen souls could therefore taste this previously unknown life, Krishna consciousness, as full of brace. Prabhupada had concluded his poem, "The line of service as drawn by you is pleasing and healthy like morning dew, the oldest of all but in a new dress, miracle done, your divine grace." Krishna consciousness was Sanatana Dharma, the eternal religion, and as such, could accurately be described as the oldest of all. But the powerful preaching mission of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, in the shape of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's International Society for Krishna Consciousness, was now appearing in the world, quote, "in a new dress," unquote. Just as Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had great hope in Srila Prabhupada, Prabhupada now had great hope in his young disciples in Australia. Now it was up to them to, quote, "administer this novel idea to the people in general very magnificently." Prabhupada gave a hint about the magnificent scale of things to come in Australia. "I wish," he wrote to Bali Mahdan, "that you establish at least 10 centres in Australia or in the adjoining islands. That is my desire." And Srila Prabhupada's desire came about. There's more than 10 temples in Australia, New Zealand, and the adjoining islands, many more. One day, Upendra and Bali Mahdan discovered the domain, a vast, well-kept expanse of parkland dotted with sprawling old fig trees near the city. The domain was well known as a, quote, "park for the people," unquote, where for years thousands had flocked to watch cricket matches and military reviews. More recently, the domain had been host to protests against the presence of nuclear bases and Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. Within walking distance of their small temple, it came alive every Sunday afternoon, offering instant crowds that eagerly gathered around everyone and anyone who had something to say. Philosophers, evangelists, political activists, and popular heroes would proselytize atop ladders, in the same way as in Speaker's Corner at London's Hyde Park. As the devotees arrived each week, dozens of speakers would already be standing on top of ladders and boxes. They promoted a vast array of doctrines: creationism, rationalism, pacifism, republicanism, to name but a few. Fundamentalist Christians with banners proclaiming, "Ye must be born again," and "the end is nigh," vied for attention with other real and quasi-religious preachers. Communists and anarchists stood beside Irish revolutionaries and old Aboriginals singing songs. While members of the Flat Earth Society displayed their pamphlets and posters, other groups held placards proclaiming "Populate or perish," "Keep Australia white," "Say no to yellow peril," "Dagos, wops and wogs," and even "Kill a commie for Christ." One especially popular speaker was Webster, an intense and loudmouth man who amused, taunted, and verbally assaulted his audience with a seemingly endless array of pseudo-intellectualism, philosophical hodgepodge, and sexual innuendo. Until the devotees started coming, Webster would regularly draw the biggest crowds. The devotees soon began to give him stiff competition, much to his chagrin. After chanting and addressing the crowd for some time, Upendra, or Bali Mahdan, would extend an open invitation to the crowds to return with them to the temple for a love feast. The devotees would then walk back across the grasslands, followed by an assortment of hippies and free spirits, past the wharves and up the staircase on the cliff face that led to the quaint old temple at Potts Point. Upendra was an excellent cook, and he regularly spent Saturday afternoons and Sunday morning preparing an assortment of tasty dishes: rice, vegetables, salted peanuts with raisins, buttery halva, and thick cold sweet rice. These were served to guests in small teaspoon quantities. On special occasions, Upendra would prepare sweet balls, gulab jamans, just like Srila Prabhupada had shown him. He would stay up late Saturday night, slowly deep-frying the small balls in ghee on a low heat until they turned golden brown and full. Then one by one he would lift them out of the ghee with a slotted spoon and soak them in thick sugar syrup. Upendra took pleasure in informing the guests that Prabhupada had named these sweets ISKCON bullets because they were weapons in the war against Maya. Srila Prabhupada had originally adopted the name Love Feast back in 1966. Prabhupada had told the devotees that such feasts for the public should become an important part of ISKCON. As he had explained many times, food offered to Krishna becomes spiritual, and whoever eats the prasadam receives great spiritual benefit. So Krishna's mercy in the form of delicious prasadam became a regular weekly event in Sydney. Christopher Warden, an outspoken, intelligent young American, along with his girlfriend from the north of England, Christine Flynn, had recently arrived in Australia on a world tour via Indonesia. Hitchhiking through Darwin in Australia's tropical Northern Territory, they had spent some time in Townsville, working in a youth hostel. Now living in an inner city suburb of Sydney, Chris, who was an ex-Peace Corps volunteer, worked as a brickies labourer. Christine, employed as a cocktail waitress, made more money just in tips than Chris did all day. Chris recalls, "I was coming home from work one night." I should inform you, actually, if you know Charu Prabhu and his wife Vaibhavi, this is how they came to Krishna consciousness. Charu was Chris. So if you know how Charu speaks with that lovely accent, you can imagine him giving this description. "I was coming home from work one night. I had to take the subway to work, and I was being spewed out of Wynyard Station onto George Street in downtown Sydney with thousands of other commuters. I had to make a right turn in order to catch a bus to Potts Point, where we were living at the time, in a basement apartment. A little flash of colour caught the corner of my right eye, and I turned and I saw my first devotee, whose name I later learnt was Upendra. He was wearing a turban, so I didn't notice the shaven head immediately. He wore a yellow robe and the sleeveless sweater that Upendra was so fond of wearing. He was standing, beaming his typical cherubic smile with a Back to Godhead magazine extended. I asked him, "What's this all about?" He told me something that made a lot of sense to me. He hooked me in, if you like. He said that love of God is a dormant propensity in the heart of every living being, not only spirit souls in human bodies, but everything that is animated. He also said that love of God can be awakened by the chanting of Hare Krishna. Just as a seed is nourished by water, he said, similarly, the seed of love of God is nourished by chanting Hare Krishna. There was a businessman passing by quite close to where we were standing, off to the side of the sidewalk. And Upendra leaned forward and said, Hare Krishna, into the right ear of this fellow as he walked by. This was a demonstration, I suppose, of the watering process. He explained to me that it was inconsequential whether or not that man understood the import of the sound vibration entering his ear. The effect was there anyway. God and his name were absolute. Upendra gave me a card and invited me to the temple that evening. End of quote. The quaint little four-roomed house with blue Hessian-covered walls and panoramic views of Sydney had become the venue for classes on Bhagavad Gita, held on Monday, Wednesday and Friday evenings. It so happened that the temple was just around the corner from where Chris and Christine were living. Another miraculous coincidence. Just like Bill, when he first came to the Devotees, he was living right round the corner. Chris and Christine were living right round the corner. Sydney's a big place. They had planned to go to another yoga meeting that night, but on returning, Chris told Christine, let's not go to this other meeting. Let's go to the one just around the corner. Chris recalls, I remember walking into that tiny room that was their main temple. As the fog of incense cleared, I saw the shaven heads for the first time, but I didn't really get a feeling that it was all that strange, as a lot of people might have done when they walked into such an alien environment. When I heard Upendra's lecture, I found him a very, very charismatic and magnetic speaker. He was so accomplished as to present the philosophy in a crystal clear way. I could not dispute anything he said, and was very curious and eager to find out more. Christine was not so immediately philosophically convinced. Why were they dressing up as Indians, she thought. And besides, she found sitting cross-legged in a micro miniskirt an acrobatic impossibility. At one point in the talk, she giggled at something Upendra said. Chris turned and told her to keep quiet. In deference to him, she kept silent for the rest of the evening and tried to understand what it was all about. Chris bought a newly arrived Back to Godhead magazine that night and began regularly attending the Sunday feasts. On the 12th of April, the Sydney daily newspaper The Sun Herald published a comprehensive report on the Sydney devotees. The article, entitled Hare Krishna at Potts Point, was accompanied by a photo of an austere-looking Bali Mahdan sitting cross-legged on the floor with a madanga drum, speaking to the bearded reporter who sat submissively nearby. Upendra sat beside a simple altar which appeared to be only a couple of boxes on top of each other, covered with some plain cloth, and adorned with 2 candle holders and various pictures. The reporter Chris Pritchard wrote an accurate and honest account of his visit to the temple. Quote, this week I spent a day in the Sydney temple of the Hare Krishna religion, the first Sydney temple. Introduced to Australia last month, the faith was taken from India to the United States 4 years ago. It has grown to its present position of having tens of thousands of members, as well as buildings and farms throughout North America and Europe. The International Society for Krishna Consciousness has established its Australian headquarters in an old rented house at Potts Point. The article continued. The sweet smell of incense drifts out into the alley outside the blue-painted dwelling. In the garden are 2 young men, both Americans, one married and one a bachelor, dressed in long robes, clasping their hands in front of them. That's Bali Mahdan and Upendra. They stroll slowly up and down the garden, chanting words familiar to most Australians under the age of 21. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. The chant is well known, of course, because it is featured in one of the songs from the musical Hair. But very few of the young who hear it associate it with the Hare Krishna religion. Inside the house, a man, following an Indian recipe, cooks a vegetarian meal of rice and vegetable balls. Sounds like kofta. In another room, a group of Australians listen to Hare Krishna music. I slip off my shoes and follow the two Americans into the holiest room, the temple of Hare Krishna. We sit, feet crossed, in front of the altar, which is decorated with pictures of Prabhupada A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, international leader of the faith, and the man who took it from its home in India to the rest of the world. I ask them their names. The one with glasses stops playing his drum and says, "We dropped our American names when we became full-time Hare Krishna missionaries last year. I am Bali Mahdan Das and my friend is Upendra Das. We were given the task of coming to Australia to set up 10 Hare Krishna centres in preparation for a visit here at the end of the year by our world leader." Well, they didn't actually open up 10 centres by the end of the year, but it did happen. Our start here has been small and our pockets are empty. Our diet is frugal. But look at what happened in Britain. We had no support last year, but now we are filling every crevice of a 5-story building we brought from the Salvation Army. That's their temple in Berry Place that was established. The two former university students studied Eastern religion and found themselves attracted to the Hare Krishna movement. They admit openly that their beliefs and demands may be too great for most people. We don't smoke or drink. Even tea is taboo. And gambling is not allowed. Drugs and illicit sex are also forbidden. Upendra Das and Bali Mahdan are aware that hippies find their philosophy attractive, but few of the hippies are prepared to surrender their own desires to the simple tastes of Hare Krishna. Ours is a religion of joy, though, says Upendra Das. End of article. Willie Pfantner, a tall, thin Swede with a long Viking moustache and blonde hair, was walking through King's Cross late on Easter Friday night when he saw a big crowd next to the El Alamein fountain. As he walked closer, he heard the chanting more clearly and immediately recognized the words. Willie recalls, "My friend Jürgen Sundvall and I had been travelling from Sweden to Australia. On the way, we had picked up a record album by the Fugs with a track featuring Allen Ginsberg chanting the Hare Krishna mantra. We chanted it constantly as we trekked through Nepal. Bali Mahdan sold me a pamphlet on chanting Hare Krishna that night, and I brought it home. Jürgen was also very interested. On the pamphlet it said, 'Love Feast every Sunday, 4:30 p.m, 26 Hordens Place, Potts Point.' So we went." Unquote. They were happy to find that the devotees read the same edition of Bhagavad Gita as they did. In Afghanistan, someone had given them Srila Prabhupada's blue abridged Macmillan Bhagavad Gita as it is, and they had both been reading it. Jürgen recalls, I should break the suspense here and tell you, Jürgen became, my mind's gone blank. I'll remember in a moment. I was also reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Bali Mahdan took me into the veranda that overlooked the city and proceeded to smash all my philosophical ideas. Bali Mahdan was good at smashing philosophical ideas. I remember he smashed a few of mine. I thought he was really heavy, but over prasadam, he changed. He was actually a really nice person. Willie and Jürgen, who became Ajit and Bhagavan, Ajit actually went on to translate Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita into Swedish, and Jürgen Vegavan married an Australian girl at the Cross Mahdan Festival in Bombay in 1971, and started the first Krishna Consciousness Center in Sweden. So there's a wonderful history here. Willie and Jürgen began chanting on beads. The philosophy started making sense, and they liked the association of devotees. They both regularly smoked marijuana, but by chanting, they found themselves gradually losing the taste for their hedonistic lifestyle. They were attracted to Krishna consciousness, but they couldn't make a firm commitment. Bill was regularly helping Upendra in the kitchen and would delight in hearing him speak of the early days of Krishna consciousness in America. As Upendra busied himself stirring pots of vegetables and preparing a variety of savoury items, Bill would roll Simply Wonderfuls, confections made from sugar, butter and powdered milk, for the Sunday feast. Bill liked this association with Upendra, and he especially loved Simply Wonderfuls. By now, he had added 10 kilos to his once lanky frame, and Upendra called him a prasadam addict. Unfortunately, however, while he basked in Upendra's warm association, Bill found Bali Mahdan too intense. Bali Mahdan would constantly attack Bill's well-grounded impersonal philosophical understandings. Bill found him abrasive and wondered how much longer he could take it. As his second week in the temple drew to a close, Bill decided to move on. He drew up a sign that read Queensland, which he planned to flash at passing cars announcing his hitchhiking intentions to Australia's tropical north. He quietly packed his bags. But on the Sunday morning, Upendra asked Bill if he would cook the sweet rice for the Sunday feast. Bill, feeling obligated, dutifully stirred the large pot of milk until it condensed, thickened, and reached the desired creamy consistency, a 3-hour feat. Wow, it's getting late, thought Bill, as he put down the spoon. It's almost time for the Sunday feast. Bill decided to head for sunny Queensland after the feast. But by the time he had filled up with all his favourites, Simply Wonderfuls included, halva and sweet rice, and came back for seconds, he was completely satisfied. The thought of moving on no longer appealed to him. He unpacked his bags and rededicated, hid a plate of Simply Wonderfuls in his locker for the forthcoming week. Along with attracting young people to Krishna consciousness, the enthusiastic chanters, now comprising Bali Mahdan, Upendra, Bill, and sometimes a few hanger-oners, also inevitably attracted the attention of the police. As the devotees drew bigger crowds, the police became more disturbed. First came the warnings. Don't you know it's illegal to chant on the street? Soon it was commonplace to be moved on. The very same thing happened in America with Srila Prabhupada. On Saturday night, as King's Cross came alive, a large paddy wagon pulled up. One Saturday night, as the cross came alive, that's the nickname for King's Cross, which was the number one happening place in Sydney for the happening people. A large paddy wagon pulled up. I have to explain what a paddy wagon is. We have to give some translations from the Australian. A paddy wagon is a huge police van that can hold a whole lot of people that are arrested. They open up the back doors. It's dark inside. There's no windows. There's no seats. They arrest you. I've been in one of them. They arrest you and then they throw you in. And they throw you in so you land on the hard metal and it makes a thump. And then they slam the door. And then they drive really roughly with you inside. So you keep falling over and smashing against the walls. It's part of the paddy wagon routine. 2 burly policemen jumped out. Okay, who's in charge here? One snarled. Bill and Upendra turned and glanced sheepishly at their Sankirtan leader. and Bali Mahdan spent the night in the Darlinghurst lockup. This was not the first time that devotees would be incarcerated, but you'll have to stay tuned for that. Consequently, Bali Mahdan was obliged to appear at the Court of Petty Sessions. A report, along with a news clipping, Hare Krishna sect leader in court, was sent to Srila Prabhupada, who replied with practical advice on the 19th of April, 1970. Quote, "For the service of Krishna, you are already in the jail for a few hours. So, if possible, try to put this movement as cultural instead of religious. Actually, we are presenting the culture of Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is well known all over the world, and it is widely read by scholars and philosophers alike. The religionists never read Bhagavad Gita. I have never seen a priest of another religion reading this book, but there are many scholars and philosophers all over the world who read Bhagavad Gita regularly. Even politicians and professional men read Bhagavad Gita, just like one Dr. Rele in Bombay. He also presented a commentary on Bhagavad Gita on the basis of medical science. I heard that Professor Einstein, the greatest scientist, was regularly reading Bhagavad Gita, and later on he became practically God-conscious. By scientific research, he appreciated the wonderful cosmic manifestation, and as a scientist, he admitted that behind this there is a very great brain, and that is God. So practically it is not a religious study, and we are presenting Bhagavad Gita as it is. Anyway, you are getting a chance to preach amongst the students, and that will be a very nice program. So even though the local law is prohibitive for chanting on the street, you can take advantage of this educational institutions. We are not concerned with any particular place or situation, but we take the opportunity of chanting and speaking wherever it is possible." End of quote. Prabhupada also mentioned in his letter that a young brahmachari, Tirthapada Das, would soon be arriving from London. Prabhupada had originally written to Mukunda a few months back asking him to, if there were any spare devotees in London, please send them here to help these boys set up things nicely. And they sent Tirthapada Das, who was an accomplished carpenter and a musician. Upendra had gotten married only a week before leaving America for Sydney. He was by now missing his wife Chitralekha, who was supposed to be joining him, but was having visa problems. The police maintained their vigilance, and Upendra felt discouraged by these new austerities. Krishna consciousness was rigorous enough without having to deal with the law, he reasoned. Comprising his thoughts, and inserting some latest news clippings, Upendra wrote to Srila Prabhupada, who replied with more practical solutions and advice on the 22nd of April, 1970. Actually, Srila Prabhupada, he maintained the whole Krishna consciousness movement, especially in those early years, by letter. Everything was done by letter. There was no emails. You didn't expect to get an instant reply. There were no Facebook chats. Prabhupada didn't use the telephone, and we sent letters, and everything went on nicely. He wrote to Upendra, "Don't worry about your wife," he wrote. "She is trying to get an immigration visa, and Madhurvisa is helping her." She was in India. "In the meantime, I'm enclosing here with a copy of the police officer's letter to me, and I hope this will help you to get police permission for Sankirtan. We are the best peaceful group in the world, and we are trying to bestow upon the people the supermost knowledge for humanity. Everyone should cooperate with us, but unfortunately, this is the age of Kali, and people are not very much eager to accept genuine things, so don't be disappointed. Do as you are doing now, and Krishna will help you without fail. To face difficulty in the course of preaching work is a kind of austerity. These difficulties do not go in vain. The more we face difficulties, the more we draw the attention of Krishna. So in that way, we shall be prepared to meet all kinds of difficulties in our preaching work. Such an attempt gives us a lift in our progressive march in Krishna consciousness. In my last letter to Bali Mahdan, I have already written that I was very much anxious to hear from you. Now this letter has given me such relief. Thank you very much that you are working so hard for this movement, and surely Krishna will reward you sufficiently for your transcendental labor. Be blessed and preach. Prabhupada added a handwritten postscript. Gargamuni has informed me yesterday that he has not yet received the $1,500. They requested Gargamuni to lend them $1,500 so they could show it at immigration when they entered the country, as per the rules. And they promised to send Gargamuni the money back, but unfortunately the money had been spent on the first month's rent in their new temple. So unfortunately, Gargamuni never received that money. By April 1970, ISKCON consisted of 26 branches worldwide. It was clear that as the devotees thought constantly of Prabhupada, he was also thinking constantly of them. Indeed, to say that Srila Prabhupada was grateful for his young disciples to take risks and perform austerities on his behalf was an understatement. Prabhupada wrote to Sridham Das, a young devotee opening a small center in Providence, Rhode Island. Quote, "As soon as a center is opened and my disciples conduct it nicely, it gives me Vaikuntha bliss. Vamanadeva is doing very nicely in St. Louis, and I am sending herewith some pictures of his activities. So, Bali Mahdan and Upendra are doing nicely in Sydney also. All this news is to me life-giving ambrosia. So the more you open branches, the more I increase my duration of life. Therefore, if you all, my students, want me to live for some days more, go on opening nice branches, as many as possible." End of quote. Noel, the taxi driver. Noel, the taxi driver, had picked up Bali Mahdan at the airport when he first came to Australia. Noel, the taxi driver, had stopped visiting the temple on the plea of philosophical doubts. But Jan, the movie actress, was coming around more often. Jan enjoyed the chanting and especially relished the prasadam, hot milk flavored with nutmeg and bananas, and the slices of orange and figs served after the mid-week classes. I remember those very well. That was my first taste of prasadam. Hot milk with bananas and slices of orange and figs. Excuse me. Jan liked to sometimes join the chanting party at the fountain. The Beach Boys were doing a series of shows at the Chevron Hotel. Jan had befriended them and invited them to the temple. Although they never came, their suave, well-dressed young manager did visit one day and brought some strawberries as an offering to Krishna. The devotees were impressed. It would be very prestigious if Jan could join them, they thought. Certainly the chanting was having an effect on Jan. She found her values were changing, and she had recently become a vegetarian. But she felt herself resisting. She could not accept all the philosophy and had brought a copy of the Bhagavad Gita as it is, she reasoned, only to help the devotees out. And Bali Mahdan and Upendra, she noticed, would argue a lot. But she still enjoyed the street chanting. One day she asked if she could wear a sari on Sankirtan. Upendra offered Jan one of his wife's saris, but didn't know how it went on. Jan recalls, "Upendra tried to help me out with it, and I put it on over my jeans. But he got it wrong and somehow wrapped it around twice instead of once, and I had to walk to the fountain taking tiny steps. I could hardly sit down and felt like an Egyptian mummy. I decided there and then that there was no way the devotees were ever going to get me to join." Or so she thought. Jan had plans to further her career overseas. She felt that her priorities to establish herself in the acting world, did not sit comfortably with an austere, regulated life based on devotional principles. Jan recalls, "One day, Bali Mahdan came right out and said it, 'Why don't you come and live in the temple?' I looked at the rooms. No furniture, no carpets on the floor, no television, no stereo, nothing. Just some old sleeping bags hanging out of a cupboard, and that was it. From that day on, I stopped coming to the temple." But Krishna had a plan for Jan, as you'll find out. The relationship between Bali Mahdan and Upendra was strained. Bali Mahdan was asserting himself as the temple president. But since there were only 3 devotees in the temple, Upendra found it distasteful. Bali Mahdan was even threatening to go elsewhere, and both wrote to Srila Prabhupada complaining of numerous misunderstandings between them. Prabhupada tactfully pointed out the faulty mentality of both of them in a return letter. Quote, "It is very encouraging that people are coming to the extent of 40 heads. They are trying to understand the importance of this great movement, and any sane man will be able to understand that. But I do not know why our students, who are supposed to be the leaders of this movement, will fight amongst themselves for supremacy. Our whole process is of surrendering. We are taught to address others as Prabhu. Prabhu means master, and the leader of the masters is called Prabhupada. So if the Prabhus have surrendered to the Prabhupada, why shall there be any mentality of occupying the superior position? This is contradictory. Kindly stop this unnecessary misunderstanding. Both Upendra and yourself are competent and experienced, so please adjust your disagreement amongst yourselves. It is my request. As a matter of fact, you are a pioneer in taking all risks to go to Australia. Naturally, you shall be considered as the leader, but a leader's position is also very grave and responsible. A leader has to lead others very tactfully and intelligently. Kindly, therefore, do not quarrel, but go on with your duties progressively. Please try to organize the new center as nicely as possible, even at personal inconvenience. That is real service. Krishna is sitting in everyone's heart. He knows everything, what to do, so depend on him and do your duties patiently. Maya is very strong, and we are liable to fall down at any moment. We have to gather our strength by chanting the beads 16 rounds regularly and praying to the lotus feet of Krishna for guidance. I hope both of you will kindly follow my instruction and forget if there is any accidental disagreement." End of quote. Despite continuing personal disagreements, the devotees took heart and pushed on. They felt encouraged by increasing opportunities to present the Sankirtan movement. They had recently opened a club on the campus of the University of New South Wales. A royal visit to Sydney by Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip, Princess Anne and Prince Charles for the Captain Cook bicentenary gave the devotees an added venue for chanting. They chanted as crowds of thousands pressed forward to see the royal yacht berthing at Sydney Harbour. Back to Godhead magazines were going out fast as fireworks exploded overhead. On the 3rd of May, the Queen officially opened Sydney's new Kingsford Smith Airport. Almost a week later, on the 7th of May, 1970, 20,000 peaceful demonstrators crammed inner city Sydney for the 2nd annual moratorium rally, protesting against Australia's continuing participation in the Vietnam War. I was there as a schoolboy, although I didn't see the devotees. The small band of devotees happily chanted as the surging crowds reached the town hall. Their attendance was not a political statement. Rather, they took this as another opportunity to spread the holy names of Krishna to as many people as would willingly hear. By mid-May, it was becoming obvious that the run-down little temple at Potts Point was too small. Burgeoning Sunday feast crowds meant great congestion. The guests could hardly fit into the living room and spilled out onto the veranda. The devotees looked for a new temple and soon located a house in the beachside suburb of Bondi. Bali, Mahdan and Upendra discussed the possible move with the regular guests. For Chris and Christine, it seemed too far away. Warden and Willis lived in the Cross, and the Bondi location meant extra travel. But the devotees considered the house with its large backyard and roomy interior quite suitable, and soon the Sydney chapter of ISKCON had a new address. So we'll leave it there in this wonderful continuing story of the great transcendental pastimes of Srila Prabhupada and the devotees in Australia and New Zealand, the great transcendental adventure. So tune in next time as we continue to discuss this wondrous story. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Thank you very much.